Good morning. What's up?
Look, take a look at this.
And the Mets' agonizing 3.5-month slow motion collapse is complete. It is unfathomable that this collection of talent winds up outside of an expanded playoff system after having the best record in baseball for the first 2.5 months of the season. Everything goes wrong over the last 3.5 months.
Okay, so, as many of you know, I am a New York Mets fan. Last year, I produced a 1 hour and 16-minute video about the Mets season, and this year I'm not gonna do that. And that's because last year's team had stories and narratives, and it was easy to do in a format like that because there were arcs and a cohesive beginning, middle, and end, and a lot you can, identify for what was going on, and that didn't happen this year. This year requires a lot more stream of consciousness and venting and me just turning on the camera and seeing what happens.
I cannot talk about it without crying.
It's very fitting that we're gonna make a video that's about as oppositely organized as last year's for a team that's about as opposite as last year's. Last year's team starts hopeless and misguided and ends really strong and amazing, and you do the whole flippy, I don't know how to control my hands. And I wanted to wait a few days to ruminate and form my thoughts in order to be able to, point to things about the Mets' collapse this time around that I could get behind and understand and not be emotional and angry as a fan of the team and just sitting through that for the last few months. I was there at all 3 games in Miami where the wheels officially fell off and they didn't make the playoffs. My first emotions, leaving the park were of exasperation, almost exhausted at what just happened. The next day it was anger, and I realized I needed to sit with it and actually kind of become articulate with what happened, so here we are. I don't think I'm gonna scream. I'm gonna try not to cry. Let's talk about the 2025 Mets downfall. See, on my coffee, it says Happy October. Not for the Mets, it's not. The Mets community deserves the Fell For It Again award. You wanna know how long the Mets have been doing this? The University of Miami has a great wide receiver who's a freshman named Malachi Toney, and the 2007 Mets collapse started before he was born. He looks good, and the Mets are still blowing end-of-season chances in games against the Miami Marlins. About 35-40% into the season, the Mets had the best record in baseball. They looked really good, they were fun, they were winning, and then they just kind of didn't do any of those things the last 3 months of the year. That's why I'm not sure collapse is even the word, because for more than half the season, this was who they were. This disorganized mess of a team with 3 different 7-game losing streaks, and a race to the bottom of having a hard time figuring out what the worst stretch of the year was. Was it getting the brakes beaten off of you in a 3-game series to the Pittsburgh Pirates? Was it that game against Cleveland where they didn't win? Here? We would have totally beaten the throw. Why did we hold him here? Maybe that game against the Phillies where you're up 4-0, lose the 4 spot, and don't get a hit after the first inning? That game against the Braves where you give up a 9 spot and do nothing afterwards? I guess I'll list everything about the 2025 Mets that was unambiguously good the whole year. Juan Soto, Edwin Diaz, Pete Alonso, Francisco Lindor, even though I don't really think they're telling the truth about how severe his foot injury was. That's it. You can go through the whole rest of the team and assign some degree of blame. So that's exactly what we're gonna do. If you look at the offense in particular, there's a lot of guys with really good individual seasons, but for some reason it didn't click, and the offense was very, very inconsistent. They struggled with runners in scoring position, and there's that stat that's very mind-boggling, that they didn't win a single game all season when trailing after 8 innings. I don't know if there is an explanation for it. The closest thing in my head is something about being weak-willed, but that's very unfair, and I can't just assume that. But it's not for no reason, because I think the biggest problem with the Met offense all year was that they kind of rolled over and died way too easily under adversity. With the exception of that game in Chicago, they didn't really ever counterpunch when hit hard by the other team. Look at those 2 games I mentioned earlier that are perfect case in point examples. You get 4 runs in a game in Philadelphia in the first inning, you lose that lead, you don't get a hit for the rest of the game. That game against Atlanta too, you have a big lead at home, you give up 9 runs, and then you don't do anything else. There were a lot of games like that for this Mets team and this offense. Way too many to list. Pitching-wise, it's a tale of 2 seasons. They had potentially the best pitching staff in baseball when they were the best team in baseball, and far from it the second half of the year. They kind of relied on this model of like churning out new relievers every single day. They were making roster moves the last weekend of the season. Teams, especially good teams, aren't in the roster churn that late. If I had to guess, I would say that was 50% out of strategy, 50% out of necessity. Because they did have a lot of total no-shows and fatigue guys at the end of the year. To their credit, they did try to patch this issue at the trade deadline. They traded for 3 relief pitchers. 2 of them, I would say, were pretty good. One of them was getting thunderous boos whenever they would take the mound at Citi Field by the end of the year. And I think that's where the Philadelphia Phillies most edged them out as the year went on, is how they performed at the trade deadline. Harrison Bader was fantastic. Yohan Duran was great. David Robertson was an awesome find for them. He just kind of came off his couch and was a productive reliever. Because that's just who he is. I think he should be a Hall of Fame consideration. Cedric Mullins, meanwhile, as the Bader trade equivalent for the Mets, didn't really get it going. You hear reports they could have reasonably gotten Luis Robert for, price I think they should have paid. I think his ceiling would have been a lot higher than Cedric Mullins's, but they didn't do it. I'm not really going to kill them for not getting Harrison Bader, because Cedric Mullins looked better than Harrison Bader at the time of the deadline, but oh my god, did center field become a gaping hole for this team as time went on. And I think that's administratively what the biggest problem for the Mets was this year, is a really, really bad, inconsistent string of decision-making the whole year. I said the pitching kind of fell off, and it was because they didn't really have guys who could go a lot of innings towards the end of the year. They had a lot of fatigued, overworked starters who weren't capable of giving you length in games, and it became this cycle where they wouldn't pitch long, the bullpen would have to cover more innings, and the bullpen would be shot, so less good bullpen, less good starters, other teams would eat you alive. And that was very preventable, and we knew it from day 1 in spring training. Frankie Montas and Sean Manaea got hurt in spring training. Jose Quintana was very good for you in 2024, unemployed, still a free agent, and you didn't call him. He went to the Brewers, who had the best record in baseball, and had a really good year. If you just signed Jose Quintana to give you, stability as a good starter, I don't think you'd be anywhere near this position. But no, David Stearns didn't want to admit defeat on the rotation in spring training. They wanted to ride it out. And when they're riding it out in August, they have to start calling up kids to become your best starters. It's a little crazy and somewhat embarrassing that your 2 most reliable starters in September were probably Nolan McLean and Brandon Sproat, who were complete afterthoughts to be on the roster earlier in the season. That, the guys who are supposed to be good are getting totally lapped by 3 children, and 2 of the children didn't even have great stat lines by the end of the year. But the children, metaphorically speaking, being called up says a lot about how they just kind of let the pitching problem fester. In 2024, they traded for Paul Blackburn. I think they could have done a trade kind of like that in theory in the trade deadline, once it was clear that the pitching was coming, apart at the seams. They were just kind of throwing whatever at the wall and seeing what sticks by the end of the year. They sent Kodai Senga down to, instructional league ball or wherever he was. I don't think it was literally instructional league ball, but he was having his bullpens be troublesome by the end of the year. Took them way too long to realize Sean Manaea nor Clay Holmes could give you a lot of innings, and you should just, team them up into one day at a time. David Stearns had a really rough year with his acquisitions. I would give him Soto, Pete, AJ Minter. Bringing back Brooks Raley was a good move. Tyler Rogers was a nice get. Most other ones fell apart. Do I really need to throw Jose Siri's batting average on screen for you? DH was never consistent. They thought it was going to be Jesse Winker. He barely played. Starling Marte wasn't quite good enough to be an everyday DH. Brett Beatty was a nice surprise, but Mark Vientos and Ronnie Mauricio were kind of unplayable towards the end of the year, and they didn't really want to do anything about it. I'm a little surprised they didn't trade for some kind of utility infielder too, because you showed that Mark Vientos was like not a guy you wanted to play by the end of the year. His defense was very inconsistent. His base running was very inconsistent. Ronnie Mauricio doesn't cover third base in game 160, and in game 162 doesn't know the count.
And Mauricio has no idea what the count is.
So, like, not to be overly hard on the players, I think it's just more, you had a lot of guys that you really didn't want to play, but yet did nothing about it. It seemed like every button David Stearns and Carlos Mendoza were pressing, except for calling up Nolan McLean down the end of the year, was just not working. And I do have a bit of a bone to pick with the New York Mets beat reporters over that. Every question down the stretch was basically, how do you feel about losing? I'm a little surprised it didn't go more like how Manny Machado handled that.
How do I assess the season? We just lost. How do you think I assess the season? How do you think I assess it?
I don't know. That's what I was asking.
You tell me. What's a loss? We lost. How do you assess it? It's a loss. You lost. Come on, dude. I mean, you could ask better questions than that. Let's go.
There was like no insight coming out of the Met locker room at all. It was just, oh, we're too good to fail. And if Carlos Mendoza made a decision that was questionable as the manager, they just kind of took it at face value and didn't press him more. David Stearns got pressed at the end of the year. No one else did. And evidently, they didn't turn it around. That's why we're here. That's why we're in this chaotic, disorganized mess of a video. And same thing about the refusal to admit defeat problem. You know, they rostered Ryan Stanek the whole year, and he had the most appearances of any Met relief pitcher? And you brought him in that final game in Miami that you had to win to get into the playoffs. If you won this game, you are a playoff team. And what did you think was going to happen with his performance all year? I'm getting such a headache reliving all this, man. So you have a lineup that's good individual seasons, but very inconsistent. You have a revolving door bullpen that nobody can really get stability aside from Edwin Diaz for. And in the offseason, you have to figure out why you have so many guys who you're stuck with at positions that you really can't throw them in, and you have a lot of decisions to make. And that's why, like, the downfall of this team is almost not even a downfall. They showed you, for most of the season, that they had a lot of very glaring flaws. They were inconsistent longer than they were consistent, and everyone involved needs to look at that and make changes. I don't think David Stearns can reasonably expect to bring back much of this pitching staff. They clearly showed you that when the chips were down, they were not able to get it done. Same with a lot of your position players, particularly the ones you have no versatility for. And could you imagine this offense without Antoine Richardson unlocking free stolen bases? But look, I'm also a realist. I'm just a guy. I understand the Mets are probably driven even more crazy than me. What are my actionable ideas to fix it? You got rid of a lot of your coaches, and I think that's a big opportunity to add new voices. I think your bench coach should be a former manager who kind of has Pete Carroll coaching vibes to him, where he gives Carlos Mendoza a very inconsistent manager, another voice and perspective, but he would also like play blackjack with the players in the locker room. There's a lot of talk in Mets land about how Starling Marte kind of loosened everybody up, and I don't think a roster spot should be the guy who does that anymore. We didn't even mention the name Jose Iglesias once in this story. I think we're learning that the Mets are a team that kind of needs some rah-rah, kind of a guy that loosens everybody up, makes it fun to come to the locker room. And I think if we're committing to that, because we realize that's the biggest difference in vibe between 2024 and 2025, you gotta tap into some wells of guys who could do that. JD Martinez was basically around in 2024 to be a hitting coach, just make him the hitting coach for 2026. I think you need an innings-eating starter badly. It doesn't even have to be a really sexy name. It just has to be someone who gets you 5 to 6 innings a start like clockwork. You need a whole new bullpen, but that I actually think David Stearns will figure out. He's very good at finding the relievers. Evidently, he found 40-something of them this year. You just need ones that can, like, stick a little bit more, a few more dogs, so to speak. I think you really need to cut some fat on the position players. I think you need to really make decisions on guys you actually think are winning, successful players of a World Series team. You need paths for young, versatile players to come in. I think you need to just kind of rip the Band-Aid off with anybody you have even a shred of doubt about, and then put a lot of emphasis on having that new group put together for the purpose of winning games. This is New York. You have a great payroll. You have fantastic ownership. You have Lindor and Soto. Get the pieces to win. It's very clearly there. Like, you have good people here. That's why it's so annoying and agonizing that you're in this position. And again, like I said, if I feel this way, I am certain that everyone involved feels a million times more aggravated than I do. Well, maybe not. I also went to the New York Jets game the day after the Mets season ended.
Fields retreats, and he'll be set. The ball is out.
And now it's all over.
If you made it this far, thank you. I understand this is a very big change of pace, but I really think this was the only way possible to cover the 2025 Mets. Mets fans or not, I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As much of a indirect vent session as this was for me, I am sure that plenty of people watching this need the same thing, so feel free to sound off. I'm not perfect, this was just my perspective. Always was just one guy's perspective. You know whose thoughts I don't want to hear though? Jaden Daniels.
So the Mets lost, did not make the playoffs. So that's probably the biggest thing, you know, that brought a smile to my face. This past weekend, they had the opportunity to play the Marlins to clinch a playoff spot, but they lost.